This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today, and if anyone's joining us just for this evening's talk, thank you also. So I'm very pleased to introduce Kieran Connell, who is currently a research fellow in the Department of Modern History at the University of Birmingham, but will be a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast next year. Kieran's research examines cultural manifestations of race in contemporary Britain, but one of the sort of reasons that we've asked him to come and talk today is that he's been working on a quite enormous project to look at the legacy of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies after 50 years that was based at the University of Birmingham, and so kind of engaging with some of these issues of archives, but particularly that sort of temporality of something that's contemporary but now also historical. So I'm just going to hand over to Kieran, who will talk, and then we will have questions, and then we will have one. So thank you, Kieran.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the organisers of the workshop. It's been really interesting and nice to be here. I do feel a bit like I'm on trial, so I hope it'll be a bit easy on me. As I mentioned, I'm a historian, so I'm based in the Department of Modern History, so as I was saying, I do feel a little bit like a gatecrasher for the Contemporary Cultural Studies party, but I guess the relationship between contemporary culture and like the more established disciplines like history is something that I want to kind of touch upon today in this talk, and it's going to be a bit of a more formal academic paper, but I'm going to do it quite quickly because then we can drink wine, which is I'm not quite often. I'm here to talk about, I guess, an initiative that I've been involved in for probably 4 or more years now. That's a project to mark this year's 50th anniversary of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which obviously, as you probably all know, is I guess you might argue is the institutional origin of what is now a global field of cultural studies. So, unlike, I guess, most of the themes we've talked about at the workshop today, what I'm going to talk about today is a historical example of one particular way of doing cultural studies, but one I think that, I hope anyway, might contribute towards this wider project to think about what we mean by a practice of cultural studies in the context of 2014. And as you'll know, I guess, the Birmingham Centre is a historical example of cultural studies because what had become by the 1980s the Department for Cultural Studies and Sociology was, in 2002, controversially closed by managers at the University of Birmingham, in spite of an international campaign to save it. So, to say the least, there's a number of ironies about the existence of a project to mark the Centre's 50th anniversary taking place at Birmingham, which obviously is a very institution that closed it just over a decade ago. Although Birmingham closed the centre down, that hasn't stopped the name Birmingham being, I think, quite intimately associated with cultural studies. And just to give you an example from a personal memory, in 2008 I did a master's at Birmingham called Culture Inquiry, and it attracted students from all over the world, from places including the United States, Iran, Netherlands, and other places. And that's not unusual. We all know that MAs now attract, and undergraduate students attract courses attract students from all over the world. But I think what was different was the reasons that many of these students gave for coming to Birmingham to do the course. So I remember during the kind of obligatory getting to know each other sessions at the start of the course, it became clear that a lot of the students had been a little bit premature in their choice of postgraduate studies. So they'd seen the words Birmingham and cultural in the title of the MA and kind of thought it was a ghost from Birmingham's past. In fact, much to the disappointment of many of my fellow students, not only was the MA nothing to do with the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, such were the ongoing sensitivities in Birmingham regarding the centre's closure, there wasn't a single centre text on any of the MA's reading lists. I think there's a sense that Birmingham is only now beginning to come to terms with, or cash in on, depending on your perspective, its association with cultural studies, a process that has led to the aforementioned ironies being laid bare for all to see, so far as you can see behind me. In 2011, in spite of its troubled history with the centre, Birmingham University erected a blue plaque on campus in homage to the centre's achievements, and the blue plaque is the only plaque on campus that commemorates an institution as opposed to an individual. The plaque resides on the wall of the Muirhead Tower, which is a campus building where the centre was based for the longest period of time. As you can see, since the refurbishment of the building is now right next door to a branch of Starbucks Coffee. And the university also funded a major conference that examined the legacies of the centre that was held last month, and was the first time that many former students and staff members of the centre came back to Birmingham since the closure. And as we speak, there's also currently an exhibition of photographs on display at the Eston Webb building on the university campus, which is the main administrative and organisational hub of the university, featuring portraits of former CCCS students taken by the centre alumni. So before I move on, I thought it was just important to acknowledge the presence of those quite large elephants in the room. My own project, which is funded by the AHRC, has at its heart the establishment of an archive of CCCS papers, which is housed in the Cadbury Research Library on campus. Given what I've already said, you can imagine the politics of trying to set this archive up. In the early days, one correspondent wrote to us with the alternative idea of, quote, offering the centre archive to Birmingham Public Library, or to the University of Alabama in Birmingham, or, frankly, anywhere other than the University of Birmingham, end quote. I'm happy to talk about that politics in more detail at the end, but suffice to say that the archive does now exist in the University of Birmingham and comprises material from former centre directors Stuart Hall, Richard Johnson and Michael Breen, as well as from scores of postgraduate students, including people like Rebecca O'Rourke, whose box of stuff you can see behind me, Dorothy Hobson and Paul Willis. So what I want to do for the remainder of this talk is to show how this archive material can provide an insight into the centre's particular way of doing cultural studies. Specifically, the archive sheds light on what was the process of politicisation within the centre project in the aftermath of the student protest that took place on campus in 1968, and the subsequent departure of Richard Hoggett as centre director in 1969. I'm going to show how this politicisation impacted on the centre's working practices and methodologies, before ending by discussing the relevance this may or may not have for the practice of researching contemporary culture today. But I guess what I want to do to begin with, though, is to kind of sketch for you what I think has become the dominant representation of what is commonly known as the Birmingham School, much to the chagrin of kind of former centre members and staff who see it as anything but a school. And I think it's a representation that most of you will probably be familiar with. And it's an understanding of the centre as being a perennial outsider, something that's you know, at odds with the dominant ways of doing academic research, at odds with the dominant modes of academic disciplines, and also at odds with, of course, the University of Birmingham. So I think the tone for this narrative was set from the centre from the very beginning, perhaps. As you'll know, off the back of the success of this pioneering book, The Use of Literacy, Richard Hoggett established the centre in 1964, having been appointed as a Professor of English at Birmingham 2 years earlier. In his 1993 autobiography, Hoggett reflects on an initial conversation with his new head of department at Birmingham regarding this idea that he had for a postgraduate centre that would research popular contemporary culture. I cannot, of course, have a view on this precise subject, the head of department replied. You will be a professor, and if that's what you want to do, we won't stand in your way. But you will have to find the money for such a centre from the outside. So the funds for the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies eventually came from contacts that Hoggett had made with Penguin Books following the 1960 Lady Chatterley's lover affair. But Hoggett was acutely aware that his new centre would be an invitation for colleagues to accuse him of having succumbed to what he called, quote, the cult of the contemporary. The centre was eventually located in a series of huts, originally intended as temporary pre-war structures, which Stuart Hall, who Hoggett appointed as his research fellow in 1964, saw as a daily reminder of, quote, their marginal status in the field. I think this marginality was, to varying degrees then, a near-permanent presence of the centre's development. The established disciplines were regularly hostile to the presence of the centre, and what was seen, I think probably quite correctly, as a new, undisciplined approach to academic research. So, for example, Birmingham's Sociology Department was at this time headed by Charles Madge, who, as we mentioned earlier, was the co-founder of the Mass Observation Project of the 1930s, and might have been regarded as something of a fellow traveller of the project to research contemporary culture. But when in 1967 Hoggett and Hall gave a paper at the Department of Sociology, it was received with fairly considerable hostility. Hoggett subsequently wrote to Madge and complained that, quote, "As the discussion progressed, I felt less that we'd been asked to come and talk about the centre and its possible relationships with social scientists, and more that we'd been put on trial," end quote. Alongside this, as we know, managers at the University of Birmingham periodically subjected the centre to various reorganisations and relocations. This was a process that, at one point in the 1980s, when the centre was being reconstituted as a department with a considerable undergraduate degree, centre staff members seriously began to consider the option of moving from Birmingham to a potentially more hospitable home at Sussex University. So the good thing about the archive is that it kind of allows us to see why from the very beginning the centre had become a target for academic colleagues and university managers alike. As I discussed, the politics of 1968 were a crucial part of this process. But I think it's also important to recognise that Hoggett's initial intervention to set up a space explicitly for the academic study of contemporary popular culture was in itself, at that point in 1964, a really quite a radical step. And although what I usually emphasise are the changes that took place at the centre after Hoggett left in 1969, I think what's interesting is the extent to which this prospective field he set out in his inaugural lecture at Birmingham was actually quite rigorously taken up by students and staff members at the centre quite a long time after his departure. So Hoggett ended his inaugural lecture at Birmingham with a list of the areas of popular culture that he wanted his new centre to study. This included radio, television, drama, the press, magazines, popular songs, and music in all forms. So, correspondingly, one of the first major studies the centre produced after Hoggett was resistance to rituals, which you could see as an account of working class youth cultures that was, in some ways anyway, an extension of the first half of the use of literacy. In 1978, obviously paying Policing the Crisis, which was co-authored by Hall and 4 postgraduate students at the centre, and featured a lengthy analysis of the British press. In 1982, Dorothy Hobson published her account of the relationship between working class audiences and the Crossroads soap opera. And then, of course, Angela McRobbie's seminal From Jackie to Just 17 was published actually in 1991, so almost 3 decades after Hoggett's original Birmingham lecture. In spite of all this, though, in spite of these similarities and correspondences with Hoggett's initial kind of project and what the centre actually went on to do, I do think that it was inevitable that, to some extent, what the culture studies centre was going to do did change after Hoggett left to go and join UNESCO in Paris in 1969. And one such change is the quite well known, I think, embrace of continental theory like Althusser, Gramsci, Lacan, and to a lesser extent Foucault. But alongside this, one of the themes that the archive allows us to explore is that after Hoggett, the centre's work also became a lot more political. And it's this politicisation that I just want to spend the remainder of this talk talking to you about. So this is an edition of, from May 1968 of the university's, it's now defunct magazine, Mermaid. And this particular issue consists of a series of articles, mostly by students at the university, many of whom were either studying at the centre at the time or had quite a close connection to it. So, for example, Trevor Blackwell was a researcher working on one of the centre's first studies on the popular press. Trevor Millen was researching girls' magazines at the centre. Catherine Hall, although a student at the history department, had recently married Stuart Hall. And the essays that these and other students had written for this issue were all about the nature of the university. So they were an attempt to reinterpret conventional thinking about universities, their practices, and also the wider role of universities in society. And the Sir on the front cover of the magazine was the University of Birmingham's then Vice Chancellor, so he was called Sir Robert Aiken. And this particular issue was edited by Stuart Hall, who by now had been a research fellow at the centre for 4 years. So Hall himself also contributed an article to this issue, which tried to bring together the overarching themes of the students' essays. So he described the essays as, quote, part of a wider current of anxiety about the place, purpose, function and meaning of the university in society, end quote, and argued that universities themselves had not done enough to encourage this kind of discussion. In fact, Hall argued, universities were actively trying to discourage that kind of discussion. Elites of authority, Hall wrote, treat questioning or critical members of the non-elite like fevered patients whose symptoms have to be called out by a mixture of smooth public relations and brusque displays of authority. For Hall, the most worrying problem of all was the fact that university institutions, quote, whose very raison d'etre is the fostering of the spirit of scientific inquiry and criticism, spend a good deal of time managing and manipulating criticism and drawing invisible lines to circumscribe inquiring minds, end quote. The university must remain a critical institution, Hall wrote, otherwise it's nothing. What's interesting though is, within 6 months of this edition of Mermaid having been produced, mirroring events that have taken place in Europe, the United States and beyond, students at the University of Birmingham staged a sit-in on campus, occupying the Vice-Chancellor's office in the Aston Webb building, which, as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, is the very same building that now houses an exhibition of CCCS photography. Centre students were heavily involved in the sit-in. Paul Willis described the centre as the standing committee of the student revolution, and remember his shock at seeing Stuart Hall, who of course at this point was deputy director of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where Willis himself had just enrolled as a PhD student. He remembers his shock at seeing Stuart Hall addressing the sit-in. For Willis, Hall came across not as a professorial figure, but a revolutionary and radical figure, speaking to masses of students. Like the series of articles in Mermaid, however, the aims of the protesters were, I think, quite modest, gentle, also looking back, but questioning. It was less a situationist avant-garde rebellion of the Parisian tradition, Michael Green argued, and more earnest and responsible concern with representation and governance. Yet the subsequent effect it had on the centre was significant. Sit-in transformed the centre, Paul Willis reflected. It transformed how we would approach intellectual work. Hoggart left the centre in 1969 to take up his position in UNESCO in Paris, partly as a result of the discomfort that was caused by the centre being so openly and so brazenly involved in the student protests on campus. Stuart Hall succeeded him as director the same year, and it was during this period that the centre embarked on what Hall called, writing in 1971, an experimentation in democratisation. The aim, he wrote, was to challenge and modify the prevailing modes of knowledge and authority, and to initiate a form of, quote, utopian enclave that could transcend the limits of what appeared possible and natural within the existing limits of our situation, end quote. One student, also writing in 1971, summarised his position as a kind of watered-down, red-based theory. So what this actually meant in practice was the opening up of the decisions related to the day-to-day management of the centre, its intellectual scope and its future direction to the students. I think it's worth remembering though at the outset that the centre wasn't anything like the kind of academic departments or faculties that we're all used to today. Once Hoggart departed, the centre only had 2 members of staff, so 2 teaching members of staff. That was Stuart Hall and Michael Green, as well as a secretary called Joan Good. Yet by the mid-1970s and the establishment of the centre's MA, there were more than 50 postgraduate students attached to the centre, and only 1 additional member of staff, Richard Johnson, who had been appointed from the history department. So this kind of rupturing of the staff-student relations that the centre were engaged in, on the one hand, it was, I guess, a response to a practical need for the students to actually shoulder some of the workload. But on the other hand, the process was accelerated at much greater speed after the events of 1968, and it took a number of kind of very overtly political forms. So Stuart Hall remembers one of his first decisions as acting director was to open up to the students' use of what was called a Gestetner machine, which I had no idea what this was, but Google tells me is a sort of printer or photocopy that produced kind of very do-it-yourself, publications. I got some money and I bought a second Gestetner machine, Paul told me in an interview. One for the office and one for the students. They could write what they liked and distribute it without my say-so. So this is a memo that was given to all new centre students that was basically giving instructions on how to actually use this quite what would now seem anyway as being quite an antiquated piece of machinery. It's entitled Office Gamesmanship or How to Use the Gestetner and Astonish Your Friends. So a whole range of material was produced on this Gestetner machine. Not only, some of you may know the famous stenciled occasional papers, they were produced on this machine, but also material that was only connected to the centre indirectly. So on the left of the screen, is the first issue of Birmingham Street Press, which, as you can see, was a very, very do-it-yourself magazine, produced by centre members Michael Green, Ross Brunt and Richard Dyer, in order to, quote, report and explore those aspects of Birmingham life that the national and local press cannot or will not deal with, end quote. On the right of the screen is an issue of Boss's Enemy, which was a kind of, I guess, a Trotskyist magazine co-authored by various postgraduates at the centre. So students became active participants in the running of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. A weekly general centre meeting was established, at which, according to Hall, everything about the centre was discussed. As John Clark, who arrived at the centre in 1972, puts it, this meant, quote, everything from the politics of intellectual work to how to manage the paper supply, end quote. This democratisation extended to the students playing an active role in determining who was admitted to the centre to study in the future. So there's an interesting passage in Hoggart's autobiography in which he writes at the time at the centre when, after the sit-in, an unnamed student demands a commitment from Hoggart that only students with a similar political outlook be admitted to the centre to study. We have no time, Hoggart quotes a student saying, for the Matthew Arnold liberal humanist line of Hoggart. After Hoggart's departure then, students would indeed sit on interview panels with prospective students. An admissions advisory group was set up, which the students ran. The centre even set up its own hardship fund, which was a levy taken on anyone who earned a salary of 2.5%, which was then distributed to those who didn't have scholarships in order to help them pay the rent. So, alongside this internal democratisation, there was also kind of overt links made with external politics. There was a very clear desire for the centre to link up, to not be made to go out of the ivory tower and to take an active role in the political climate of the late 1960s and 1970s. So, for example, in 1976, one of the centre meetings was moved in order for centre members to attend a strike that had been held over workers' rights at Grunwick, which was a film processing lab in London. A so-called active praxis group was established at the centre, the aim of which was to explicitly discuss radical politics. I don't know if you probably know, but Police in the Crisis was written with the direct involvement of a centre student, Chaz Critcher, in 40 Hall Road, which was a community group set up in the Handsworth district of Birmingham. And this is a bizarre kind of poster that was put up in the window of this community centre, giving local residents advice on issues like police harassment or tenancy rights. In 1978, another centre student, Tricia McKay, was an active player in the establishment of a women's refuge centre in an abandoned Victorian building in Birmingham. And around the same time, two other centre students, Rebecca O'Rourke, I mentioned, and Myra Connell, established the Women and Words writing group, which was designed to encourage working class women to take part in narrating their own histories and experiences. For Stuart Hall, writing in the early 1970s, the aim of all this was, quote, nothing less than curation within the existing system of a collective, an institutional foco, a sort of advanced base, end quote. In comparison with the situation before 1968, Hall recently told me, the centre had changed out of all recognition. So I just want to kind of briefly conclude really by talking about the relevance that all this may have or may not have to this issue of thinking about what the practice of contemporary cultural studies should look like today. And I think when thinking about this question of this pioneering work of the centre in cultural studies now, I think it's quite easy to get tangled up in this narrative of decline and of loss. And I think the key aim of what I tried to talk about today is to show just exactly how historically specific the centre's work was. It was a particular product of a more general move to narrate and take seriously the everyday experiences of working class people. A move also seen in the mass observation project of the 1930s, but also in the work of Richard Hoggart and similar figures like Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson. So the centre's work came out of that tradition, but as I've shown in this talk, it was also fundamentally influenced by the politics and ethos of that particular and very weird, I think, moment of 1968. And its subsequent trajectory into the 1970s and 1980s was also, I think, influenced by distinct historical themes. So, for example, the increasing centrality of the identity politics of race, gender, class, and sexuality, and the subsequent fragmentation of the left more generally. So given the specificity of these themes, in many ways I'm actually not entirely sure how useful it is to think about the centre's trajectory as a way of trying to define what cultural studies practice should look like now. Yet at the same time, I think it's probably inevitable, given the kind of pioneering work of the centre, that its story does cast a long shadow. Certainly I think many practitioners, and not those who directly from the centre tradition, often return again and again to Birmingham, even as they claim to be trying to move beyond it. So I think in particular, cultural studies is often somehow still portrayed as being this perennial outsider, just like the centre was for the best part of 4 decades. So Larry Grossberg, for instance, the American professor of cultural studies, sees cultural studies as a, quote, minoritarian critical practice that, even as it becomes institutionalised in universities, is still under threat from those who would see it as a depoliticised study of anything goes. And I just want to end quickly by questioning that perception. For me, my sense is that informally, you can find versions of cultural studies pretty much almost anywhere you look in Britain today. Certainly the initial move by Hogarth was to break down the value distinction between high culture and low culture, and take so-called mass culture seriously, has to my mind almost entirely lost the radical edge that it may once have had. So for example, outside the academy, popular culture is now endlessly analysed, argued over in newspaper columns, blogs and current affairs magazines. In the last few months alone, New Statesman magazine has featured articles on the appeal of the pop star Taylor Swift, the fortunes of the England cricketer Kevin Peterson, and the philosophies of the RoboCop films. Channel 4 News now employs a culture and digital editor as opposed to an editor for the arts. And when last year Penguin Books published memoirs of Morrissey, of course they did so in the Penguin Classic imprint, originally reserved for such literary staples as Homer's Odyssey. For the writer and journalist Thomas Frank, anti-elitist and anti-hierarchical conceptions of culture have even become a staple of the lexicon of big business. For Frank, what was once a form of academic radicalism has become functionally indistinguishable from the hegemony of free market economics. Certainly, for me at least, the old boundaries between high and low culture have been blurred now to such an extent that it would be quite easy to think that they'd never existed in the first place. But this is, that's something that's going on outside the academy, but I think it's also going on, importantly, inside the academy too. Forms of cultural studies have taken root in a wide variety of places, including in once hostile academic disciplines. So in my own department of history, the colleagues have written books on subjects including smoking, television sitcoms, the semiology of iconoclasm, and the underground London gay culture of the 1950s. Postgraduate theses have recently been completed on subjects like the British reggae music of the 1980s, the styles of Northern Soul Boys of the 1960s, and changing attitudes towards women's pubic hair. More generally, the rise of research clusters, fields of inquiry, and even academic disciplines looking at subjects like porn studies, media studies, film studies, television studies, and digital culture studies. And I think likewise, academic funding bodies like the AHRC have for some time offered formal funding avenues for scholars researching exactly the kind of things that the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies was institutionally marginalised for being interested in. So Panel D of the AHRC's peer review panel is, their website tells me anyway, aimed at academics working in the fields of media and communication studies, American studies, cultural studies and popular culture, gender and sexuality, life writing, literary and cultural theory, post-colonial studies, text editing and bibliography. Similarly, the Centre's commitment to collective ways of working and to researching or reaching out to events going on outside of the academic ivory tower, whether that was in the form of self-published newspapers and pamphlets or the organisation of writing groups of working class communities, have, I think, to a greater or lesser degree, become endeavours that are actually institutionally encouraged by the AHRC. So, as a lot of you will know, the Pathways to Impact document, which is a kind of document specifically about engaging with the world outside the academy, has become a critical facet of any major application for the AHRC funds. And the so-called impact case studies that now scholars are increasingly having to engage in are, by all accounts, going to become even more important than the next research excellence framework cycle in 2020. And of course, I think collective ways of working is a bit more problematic, but we are all sitting here, I think, under a grant that's made to actually help develop collaborative skills and in ways that impact outside of the academy. So I'm going to stop in a minute before I start to sound like a cheerleader for the AHRC, because that's really not what I came here to do. But my basic point is that I think the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies was to differing degrees, both marginal and marginalised during its lifetime, but many aspects of its pioneering work have subsequently become mainstream. For Thomas Frank, the battle to rescue people's everyday cultures from the division of Marcuse, Adorno and the rest of the Frankfurt School has arguably already been won. Many of the working practices of that the Centre saw as transcending the existing limits of academic work have to some degree become institutionalised within the academy. Now, you can call this a process of commodification if you want, and I think you may well be right, but I think there is a sense that this is the reality of the structures that we are now all working in. In September last year, I went and did a recorded interview with Stuart Hall at his home in London. It was a way of ensuring that he could participate in that major conference that looked back on the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies earlier last month. And I think, because I think even then Stuart Hall knew that he wasn't going to be well enough to make the trip up to Birmingham. I ended the interview by asking him if he had a particular message for those colleagues and collaborators who were working in the cultural studies field today. And he responded by quoting Bob Marley. "Never give up the fight," Stuart said. But also, and I'm quoting here, don't expect to find the fight lodged, fully accomplished and outlined in some book. It's not coming already packaged. So don't think the work has been done by the first generation, that the Birmingham school did it all and you were just tagging along. Not at all. Not at all. End quote. I tried to show today that politics in 1968 was the key driver behind much of the Centre's work. But from the vantage point of today, that's politics that seems a very, very long way away indeed. I think that cultural studies today has got to find a politics that's specifically suited to the climate that we're all living in. Thanks a lot for listening, and hopefully we can have a drink soon.
Maybe we'll have some questions here and then we can keep chatting afterwards. Does anyone have any questions?
So it's a bit cool because I wanted to ask your own last question back to you, because I think it's a really interesting one. What are your thoughts on what the political edge of cultural studies today might be, or where is it needed?
It's an interesting question, because I'm a historian, so it's not necessarily one that I'm engaged with, but I am a historian that traces the history of cultural studies. And one of the things that Stuart Hall is keen to emphasise is that cultural studies is not a discipline. He doesn't see it as being a discipline. He sees it as being a field of inquiry that kind of takes place in like a moving target in the various different areas. I wonder because the radicalness of doing popular culture is kind of not that radical anymore, perhaps. I wonder if in certain contexts, or institutional contexts anyway, there is still an element of that radicalness, like perhaps in certain departments or certain more conservative places that don't see popular culture as a way as a subject worthy of academic study. Maybe that's where the politics of cultural studies is. But certainly, I think that the basic point I was trying to make in this talk was that if you're engaged in cultural studies now and continuing measuring yourself against what the Centre was up to, I think you're ultimately going to be fighting a losing battle, because the Centre was just so of its time and of its moment. If you came of political age in the context of what happened in 1968, compared to if you came of political age in the context of, say, New Labour, your outlook on the world is going to be just, you might as well come from a different planet, frankly. And I think that it's not, the challenge is not to kind of just try to ape what's gone on before, but just to work within the institutions of our time. And that's why I really enjoyed the previous session, because although things like impact and reaching outside of the academy kind of become institutionalised, that's not to say you can't have really significant political effects working within those systems. So I think it's a bit of a fudge really, but I think the challenge is really just to kind of acknowledge that certain battles have been won, but acknowledge that there's still a need for, say, academics to be connected to wider communities, and thinking about how the difference that they possibly can make in those communities, and you know, that's the dialogue that can happen between universities and non-academics. But I don't know if that provides any answer whatsoever.
No, it does, and it made me think maybe, as you said, those battles that we consider one, or to a large extent one here, and maybe not in other cultures or countries, and maybe that's maybe that's one of the challenges, that the community is now global. Basically.
Yeah.
I had a question comment that sort of comes off the back of that, but it's much more local about Birmingham, about the University of Birmingham. And I know I've sort of said this to you before, but you just mentioned about maybe some departments that challenge is still there, and peculiarly entirely because of the legacy of CCCS, sort of certainly kind of literary studies or the English part of Birmingham is exactly where that is still a challenge, because it's historically defined as being separate from the Centre for Cultural Studies. So in every other English department in the country, it might be that people don't call what they do cultural studies, but it's kind of an implicit part of the sort of multimodal way of thinking about narratives and fiction that we're all taught it, and sort of Birmingham's still grappling with the legacy of not wanting to use those words, contemporary culture and centre, and still playing around with in what ways it's okay to just forget something. And I was really curious about how the process of putting together the bid, the funding application and everything had gone, and whether you met with any resistance from the university, or whether everyone agreed it was time to do this. Or
I don't think the resistance came from the university, but it came from, understandably, from people who were being asked to give their stuff to a place that closed them. And that, that's a massive hurdle, and it was one that took a lot of kind of, I didn't close the centre down, and making that point clear that I'm just sort of someone who's interested in centre work, but also trying to make the case that it needs to be publicly accessible. Who's going to do it if we don't do it? Someone needs to do it. It's clearly important. It needs to be done. But also, the weird thing about it is personal relationships are just so important. And I've got a really weird perspective on all this, because I don't know if I told you, but my parents met at the centre. So without the centre, I wouldn't be alive. But weirdly enough, that was something that helped convince people who were on the fence and dubious that actually going to someone who had an investment in it, even though I might be the most hostile person in the world to cultural studies, but because I've got this personal connection to it, that enabled me to get a relationship going with a former director of the centre, who in turn got a relationship going was able to kind of bring Stuart Hall on board. And then of course, such is the position of Stuart Hall, long before he died, the last 30 years of being probably the most preeminent cultural studies practitioner in this country, arguably in the world as well. Once he came on board and said that he was going to give his stuff and wrote the email to all the kind of cultural studies alumni, most people fell into line. There's only one or two exceptions that didn't. So it's interesting how that I think follows into what we're talking about, perhaps about the institutional politics of archives and such like, and how they can be navigated through personal relations. And I remember I went to go meet Paul Willis, and I was trying to convince him to give me his stuff, and he was really hostile and kind of didn't want to. And then when I told him, in fact, I told him my parents met at the centre, it was just like putting my hands. So it's weird how these personal relationships can kind of impact on things. But I don't know if that's what you do if you're not in my situation, and you're probably just in trouble.
I've got maybe this comes across, this might come across as 2 or 3 questions, so apologies for forgotten. First of all, just really quickly, I wonder what you think about Hall's involvement with Dorian Massey after neoliberalism. Then I kind of, maybe a bit more concretely, I just wondered what you thought about the legacies of Hall's practice, the fact that the essay form is how he kind of expressed himself. In collaborations, like the major thing that he never wrote that kind of big monograph. I wonder if you could see some kind of legacies, perhaps what you've seen today or through your own practice. So, but what you think kind of after neoliberalism, and if there are any kind of legacies in Hall's practices?
Yeah, after neoliberalism is kind of interesting, I think. But I think it's kind of a bit. I personally read it and felt a bit underwhelmed.
Yeah.
I felt like it was trying to do a lot of the stuff that was doing a lot of the stuff that he'd done with like Thatcherism and then policing the crisis and then Thatcherism stuff. I thought it was a bit. I've only read the first instalment of it, so I don't know if that's just setting the scene and kind of going over a lot of the old ground. I thought it was great he'd written it. I think it's just typical of him. And I get followed to lead into your second question. I think it's typical of him that he's still so engaged with the contemporary political climate. That's his work. For me, by looking at his work historically, that's the one continuum that evolves throughout that body of work is the political engagement with contemporary events and doing that through collaborations that you wouldn't necessarily ordinarily expect. So that I think one of the kind of more underrated aspects of Hall's work is his work in the kind of black arts in the 1980s. You know, he was retired by this point, and then went off to kind of work with a whole generation of black artists like John Comfort, Isaac Julian, and various others, in ways and kind of really it made his work on multiculturalism identity kind of it brought it to a whole new audience, I think. And I think that's really, really interesting, because actually one of the criticisms that you might level at the centre generally, but and Stu in particular, is that they were committed to reaching out beyond the academy. But did they do how much? I mean, I gave you some examples in that talk, but to be honest, they spent most of their time in seminar rooms arguing about the relative merits of Alfie and Gramsci, and the archive shows that. So they were all the time committed and paid lip service to reaching out beyond the academy. But did they? I mean, how much? If you were to show, I don't know, like the average Joe, one of the stenciled occasional papers on, you know, encoding and decoding, how much breakthrough would that have? And I think Stuart's work with the black art movement of the 1980s is really one really, really important example of that kind of external dialogue. And I think that I talked about collective work towards the end of the presentation. The AHRC has got a problem with that, I think, because it doesn't, when you submit your ref, it's kind of weighted less. If I was to write a paper with Zara at the University of Birmingham, it wouldn't count for as much as the ref scores. That's a problem. But equally, they are funding things like this, so they're clearly interested in collaborative work. And I think personally, I think the short form essay, and it's just people always use that line. He never produced the one great big book. My sense is that actually, Peace and the Crisis and those kind of books are his book, but his generosity was such that he just incorporated. The way he worked was to bounce ideas off people. But one of the kind of uncomfortable parts of the archive is the extent to which his position in cultural studies is so pervasive. He's everywhere in the archive. His hands are everywhere. The best work the centre produced, he's the stuff that his involvement was in. And that's quite uncomfortable, because they tried to see themselves as being a collective practice. So how do you square that circle with his position as being one of the foremost intellectuals in post-war Britain? So it's interesting, but slightly rambling answer to your question.
No, thank you.
It's interesting that it was the kind of Black Idea Film Collective and that arts movement that kind of is in some ways his biggest external sort of outside of the academy intervention, because that is high art, really.
Well, yeah.
You know, like I mean, if in the average Joe scenario, I mean that's not a popular art history.
Very avant-garde thing.
Yeah.
It's avant-garde, and it is avant-garde, but is it less avant-garde than the paper on
No, not at all. But it's still that like.
But it's still producing work that's kind of up there. Yeah.
Any other questions for Kieran? Okay, should we thank Kieran again and move to the one?
Thanks very much.